There's an old saying that cuts through generations: the axe forgets, but the tree remembers. In a small Midwestern town, inside the cold white walls of St. Helena's Medical Center, those words would become a prophecy. For 26-year-old Ivy Ballard, it wasn't an axe that struck her, but her own family. And the scar it left would change the way she saw her entire life. The morning began with an uneasy stillness, the kind of quiet that makes you think a storm is crouching on the horizon. Ivy had walked the hospital corridors before, but never like this, never as the unwilling centerpiece of her mother's anger. Aurelia Ballard, sharp-eyed and steely even in her 50s, gripped a manila folder in her hand as though it were a weapon. The folder held Ivy's medical records. And by the time Aurelia was done, it would also hold her shame. In the middle of the hospital lobby, beneath flickering fluorescent lights, and in full view of nurses, orderlies, and families clutching styrofoam coffee cups, Aurelia tore the folder to pieces. Page after page fell like wounded birds onto the sterile tiles. The sound of ripping paper echoed louder than any scream. But Aurelia did not stop at destruction. Her voice rose high and sharp, slicing the air. "You're letting your sister die," she howled, her chest heaving as though her fury alone could draw attention from every corner of the hospital. Heads turned. Conversations froze. The security guard by the vending machine tilted his head, uncertain. A young couple with their toddler in a stroller paused, wide-eyed. In a place meant for healing, Aurelia was staging a theater of blame. Behind the glass wall of room 311, Madeline Ballard, Ivy's older sister by 3 years, watched from her hospital bed. Her skin was pale, her hair stripped away by chemotherapy, but her lips curled into a smirk. Even in sickness, Madeline wore arrogance like a crown. She didn't need to shout, her expression said it all. "I'm still the center. You're still orbiting me." Ivy stood still. She didn't rush to defend herself, didn't argue, didn't reach for her mother's wrists. Humiliation pressed against her skin like a living thing, crawling and hot. She could feel dozens of eyes clinging to her, waiting for her to break. But she didn't. Not this time. Instead, Ivy bent down and picked up a few scraps of the shredded file, ignoring Aurelia's glare. To anyone watching, it may have looked like guilt, like a daughter gathering evidence of her own selfishness. But Ivy's fingers tightened on the torn paper because she knew better. She knew what her mother had just destroyed wasn't shame, it was proof. Proof that Aurelia wanted to bury. "You ungrateful child," Aurelia hissed, her voice lower now, but no less venomous. She leaned close, eyes narrowing. "We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us." With coldness, Ivy raised her gaze, locking eyes with the woman who had birthed her. "You gave me what you thought I owed you for," she said softly, her words steady as stone. For the first time, Aurelia faltered. Just a blink, just half a breath of silence where her rage had nowhere to land. Then, louder than before, she screamed again. "You're letting your sister die." The words ricocheted off polished walls, louder than a gavel. The nurses near the front desk froze mid-step. A receptionist shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Not one of them intervened. That was the cruelest part. Humiliation was not only a weapon but a performance, and everyone around had become its silent audience. Through the glass, Madeline tilted her head, her thin lips twitching into a victorious smirk. It wasn't pity in her eyes, it was ownership. The same ownership she had wielded over Ivy since childhood. Madeline wins. Ivy yields. That had always been the script. But this time, something different burned in Ivy's chest. She didn't flinch, didn't cry. The clock above the elevator read 10:42 a.m. And Ivy thought, this is when everything breaks. Not when they scream, but when I don't. She walked away. Not hurried, not frantic. Each step deliberate, the echo of her shoes marking the end of an old life. The stairs burned her back, but she didn't look over her shoulder. Because she understood something she hadn't dared admit before. This was never about saving Madeline. This was about control. At the far end of the corridor, Ivy slipped into the consultation lounge, her pulse hammering like enemy fire. She opened her phone and scrolled to an email she had kept buried for months. The subject line read, "National Donor Match Results, Confidential." The message was blunt, clinical, undeniable, no biological compatibility detected. Not partial, not marginal, not even close. She wasn't a match, she never had been. And yet her family had dragged her into the spotlight, painted her as heartless, tried to own her with shame. Ivy hit forward. One recipient, Dr. Holstrom, head of St. Helena's Transplant Division, C.C. Laura Kent. Her attorney. Subject reconfirming non-compatibility for records. Her thumb hovered for a heartbeat, then pressed send, and for the first time in her life, Ivy didn't feel like a pawn. She felt like a storm about to arrive. The hospital's air always smelled of antiseptic, but that morning, to Ivy Ballard, it reeked of something fouler, betrayal. She had sent the email, she had gathered the scraps of her shredded records. But the echo of her mother's words still lingered in the lobby like smoke after a fire. She slipped into a quiet corner, the kind reserved for families awaiting grim news, and clutched her phone in her hand. Her pulse rattled like a drum. Every detail of that email, the subject line, the attachments, the cold language of non-compatible, was a lifeline she refused to let anyone rip away again. For 26 years, Ivy had been the quieter daughter. The one who blended into the shadows while Madeline, 3 years older, bathed in the limelight. At birthday parties, Madeline's gifts overflowed onto the kitchen table, while Ivy's sat neatly stacked in a corner. At school, Ivy was the girl with perfect attendance, while Madeline was the one teachers whispered about, the star, the promise. And at home, Aurelia's voice dripped with adoration for one daughter, while her tone toward the other carried the weight of obligation. But Ivy endured it all because she believed endurance was survival. Until now. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped her back. Broad shoulders blocked the lounge doorway, a shadow stretching long across the linoleum. Brooks Ballard, her father, entered with the kind of posture that demanded reverence, though he rarely earned it. At 58, with thinning silver hair and the permanent frown lines of a man who believed the world owed him, Brooks carried the air of someone who thought silence was strength. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He didn't even glance at the scraps of paper clutched in Ivy's hand. Instead, in a voice so flat, it might as well have been weather, he said, "You're just a selfish mistake." No venom, no fire. Just 6 words, as matter-of-fact as a diagnosis. The blow landed harder than Aurelia's screaming. Humiliation crawled beneath Ivy's skin, not because of the words themselves, but because of the indifference lacing them. It wasn't fury, it was dismissal. As though her 26 years meant nothing more than a bookkeeping error. Her breath caught in her chest, but she didn't ask what he meant. She didn't beg for clarity. Because to ask would have given him something he didn't deserve, the dignity of disbelief. Behind him, through the glass of room 311, Madeline still watched, her lips curved in that same smirk that had haunted Ivy since childhood. Her eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction, as though her father's cruelty was the final confirmation of her own supremacy. Ivy shifted sideways, careful not to brush her father's arm. In the past, such avoidance would have felt like defiance. Today it felt like survival. She reached the elevator, pressed the button, and watched the numbers descend. Her reflection in the chrome doors looked back at her, tired eyes, jaw clenched, chest rising too fast. The girl staring back was not weak, not anymore. She was angry. When the doors opened, she stepped inside and let the silence cradle her like armor. 2 hours later, Ivy's phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Dr. Holstrom. "Need to clarify inconsistency in your file. Can you return today?" Her stomach tightened into a fist. She typed back, "On my way." Holstrom nodded slowly, tapping the screen with his pen. "That's the problem. Our system shows 2 sets of data, yours and your sister's, and they don't align." Ivy blinked, confused. "What do you mean, don't align?" He turned the monitor toward her. 2 charts filled the screen, color-coded markers where overlaps should have existed. Except there were none, not even the faintest resemblance. "You are not biologically related," Holstrom said at last. 6 words. 6 words that cracked 30 years of reality in half. The air rushed from Ivy's lungs. Her mind reeled. She wanted to laugh, to protest, to scream. But all she could do was stare at the evidence glowing on the screen. Not related, not a sister, not a daughter, not a Ballard at all. A realization slithered into her gut, dark and heavy. They knew. They always knew. Every cold glance. Every offhand comment. "We didn't have to take you in." Every time love felt like a receipt instead of a gift, it all pointed here. She wasn't family, she was leverage. A body they could own. The humiliation twisted into something sharper, something hotter. For the first time in her life, Ivy wasn't just surviving their cruelty, she was preparing for war. There's a certain silence that comes after devastation, thicker than grief, heavier than anger. That's the silence that filled Dr. Hallstrom's office, as Ivy Ballard stared at the monitor. Two charts, two sets of data, two lives that should have intersected, but didn't. Not even close. You are not biologically related, the doctor had said. 6 words, spoken evenly, but they fell like a hammer against everything Ivy thought she knew. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her throat was too dry, her chest too tight. She wanted to deny it, to reach for a thread that could sew her life back together, but all she found was absence. Hallstrom cleared his throat. We ran it twice. Same results. You were adopted, Ivy. It's the only explanation. I'm sorry, adopted. A word she had never heard in her house. Not once. Because the Ballards hadn't raised her as a daughter. They had raised her as a backup plan. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. 30 years of memory rewrote themselves in an instant. Every cold shoulder, every moment her mother praised Madeline while criticizing her. Every sideways glance, from Brooks that carried the weight of "you don't belong." It all calcified into one brutal truth. They knew. They always knew. Ivy steadied her breath, though her hands trembled in her lap. I'll need documentation, she whispered. Everything printed, notarized. Hallstrom's gaze softened, his voice low. You'll have it. And Ivy, you may want to consider speaking with legal. What happened here, what was withheld, crosses ethical lines. She nodded once, rising on legs that felt foreign. The manila folder he handed her weighed almost nothing, yet it felt like iron in her grasp. Proof, irrefutable. Hallstrom nodded slowly, tapping the screen with his pen. That's the problem. Our system shows 2 sets of data, yours and your sister's, and they don't align. Ivy blinked, confused. What do you mean, don't align? He turned the monitor toward her. 2 charts filled the screen, color-coded markers where overlaps should have existed. Except there were none, not even the faintest resemblance. You are not biologically related, Hallstrom said at last. 6 words. 6 words that cracked 30 years of reality in half. The air rushed from Ivy's lungs. Her mind reeled. She wanted to laugh, to protest, to scream. But all she could do was stare at the evidence glowing on the screen. Not related, not a sister, not a daughter, not a Ballard at all. A realization slithered into her gut, dark and heavy. They knew. They always knew. Every cold glance. Every offhand comment. We didn't have to take you in. Every time love felt like a receipt instead of a gift. It all pointed here. She wasn't family, she was leverage. A body they could own. The humiliation twisted into something sharper, something hotter. For the first time in her life, Ivy wasn't just surviving their cruelty, she was preparing for war. There's a certain silence that comes after devastation, thicker than grief, heavier than anger. That's the silence that filled Dr. Hallstrom's office, as Ivy Ballard stared at the monitor. 2 charts, 2 sets of data, 2 lives that should have intersected, but didn't. Not even close. You are not biologically related, the doctor had said. 6 words, spoken evenly, but they fell like a hammer against everything Ivy thought she knew. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her throat was too dry, her chest too tight. She wanted to deny it, to reach for a thread that could sew her life back together, but all she found was absence. Hallstrom cleared his throat. We ran it twice. Same results. You were adopted, Ivy. It's the only explanation. I'm sorry, adopted. A word she had never heard in her house. Not once. Because the Ballards hadn't raised her as a daughter. They had raised her as a backup plan. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. 30 years of memory rewrote themselves in an instant. Every cold shoulder, every moment her mother praised Madeline while criticizing her. Every sideways glance, from Brooks that carried the weight of "you don't belong." It all calcified into one brutal truth. They knew. They always knew. Ivy steadied her breath, though her hands trembled in her lap. I'll need documentation, she whispered. Everything printed, notarized. Hallstrom's gaze softened, his voice low. You'll have it. And Ivy, you may want to consider speaking with legal. What happened here, what was withheld, crosses ethical lines. She nodded once, rising on legs that felt foreign. The manila folder he handed her weighed almost nothing, yet it felt like iron in her grasp. Proof, irrefutable. Aurelia staggered forward, her face draining of color. Lies, she's unstable. This is vengeance. Ivy turned to her, calm as stone. No, this is documentation. Unlike the fake signature you submitted, this one holds up in court. Reporters leaned in, cameras zoomed. A voice shouted from the back, "Do you want revenge or justice?" Ivy's eyes swept across the room, steady, unblinking. Neither, she said. I want no more silence. For a moment the room was electric. The balance of power had shifted in a single breath. The humiliation Aurelia once wielded now belonged to her. Behind her a crash, the sound of Aurelia's composure shattering, her body collapsing against the floor. Reporters gasped, cameras swung, flashes ignited. On the monitor Madeline's live feed went black. Ivy didn't flinch. She gathered the folder, stepped down from the podium, and walked toward the exit. Her heels struck the tile like gunfire. No one tried to stop her, because no one could. Not anymore. The following 48 hours at St. Helena's Medical Center were unlike anything the Ballard family had ever faced. What Aurelia had planned as a moment of public triumph had collapsed into a scandal that rattled through the halls. Nurses whispered near vending machines. Orderlies traded theories by the loading dock. Reporters camped outside the glass doors, their cameras trained on anyone leaving in a Ballard suit. For Ivy it wasn't relief she felt. Not yet. It was focus. A razor-edged clarity she hadn't known she could possess. She had lived 26 years as the overlooked one, the quiet daughter, the pawn in someone else's game. Now she was the one holding the pieces, and she intended to move them with precision. The morning after her explosive revelation, the hospital cafeteria buzzed louder than usual. At one corner table, two nurses scrolled on their phones, whispering about the headlines splashed across every local outlet. Adopted daughter exposes forged consent in organ donation scandal. The article was merciless. It detailed Aurelia's cover-up, Brooke's silence and Madeline's years of entitlement. Ivy's name was printed clear, not as a footnote, but as the headline's spine. For the first time, she wasn't erased. She wasn't an accessory, she was the storm. Aurelia tried damage control. Word spread that she had called a second press conference, claiming Ivy's accusations were a fabrication by a bitter girl desperate for attention. But when the appointed hour arrived, Aurelia stood at the podium pale and trembling, only to find reporters armed with Ivy's notarized copies. Every question sliced deeper. Why did you hide the test results? Who authorized the forged consent? Did you always know Ivy wasn't your biological daughter? Her answers faltered. Her voice cracked. By the time she collapsed into a chair, it wasn't Ivy who looked guilty. It was Aurelia caught in the tangle of her own lies. Me. Seed back in room 311, Madeline seethed. She may have been weakened by chemo, but her pride remained intact, sharpened like a blade. To her, Ivy's defiance wasn't bravery, it was betrayal. She summoned her sister with a text. We need to talk, now. Ivy arrived, not as the meek sibling who once bowed her head, but as someone armored in truth. Madeline's smirk tried to hold, but the room smelled of loss. You've ruined everything, Madeline rasped. Do you understand that? You were supposed to help me. That's what you were here for. Ivy's reply was steady, her tone almost gentle. No. That's what you told yourself I was here for. She placed the folder on the bed, open to the DNA charts. The truth says otherwise. Madeline's eyes darted to the graphs, then back to Ivy's face. For the first time, there was no arrogance in her gaze, only something rawer, something closer to fear. You don't get it, Madeline whispered. Mom and Dad only kept you in case I needed something one day. The words landed like frost. But Ivy didn't shatter, not anymore. I do get it, she said. That's why I'm done. She turned and walked out, leaving Madeline staring after her, stripped of her throne. Me. That evening Ivy met her attorney, Laura Kent, in a quiet office above Main Street. The desk between them was stacked with files, copies of every forged signature, every buried test, every timestamp of proof. We'll go public with it all, Laura said, her voice brisk, efficient. Press, legal, ethics board. Once the lawsuits land, The Ballards won't have a corner left to hide in. Ivy sipped her black coffee, her hands no longer trembling. Good, she said. Let them choke on daylight, and they did. Within days, the hospital announced an internal investigation. Local stations aired interviews with medical ethicists condemning the Ballards' actions. A hashtag began trending online. #silence is not family. Strangers posted their own stories of betrayal, adoption, coercion. Ivy's story had ignited something larger than herself. The final blow came during a televised interview. A reporter asked Ivy directly, "Do you want revenge?" Her answer was calm, deliberate, each word carrying the weight of survival turned to strength. "Revenge is too small for what they did. I don't want revenge. I want no more silence." The studio fell quiet, millions watched, and with that the humiliation that had once belonged to Ivy now belonged entirely to the Ballards. Brooks disappeared from public view, too proud to issue a statement, too cowardly to face the storm. Aurelia was admitted under stress observation. Madeline was discharged quietly, her social media scrubbed of its performative piety. And Ivy, she walked out of the studio into a clear night sky, the cameras flashing not as weapons but as witnesses. For the first time in her life, she wasn't someone else's scapegoat. She was her own name, her own voice. 7 days after the storm broke, Ivy Ballard sat on the small balcony of her downtown apartment, a chipped mug of black coffee warming her hands. The city stretched below, cars weaving, pedestrians bustling, a street violinist carving out a tune on the corner. For the first time in her 26 years, she felt like the air she breathed belonged to her, not to anyone else's demands. The headlines had not stopped. Every paper, every station, every feed carried her name. Adopted daughter exposes forged consent in organ donation scandal. The Ballards were no longer a family admired for their community standing, they were a cautionary tale. Aurelia's gratitude speech had been replayed side by side with Ivy's revelation, the contrast humiliating in its clarity. Brooks had sealed himself in silence. Madeline had been discharged in quiet disgrace, her once daily updates to social media vanishing overnight. The weight that Ivy had carried since childhood, the burden of being less than, was gone, and in its place something new had bloomed: certainty. Still, closure didn't come without confrontation. On the 8th day, a message buzzed on her phone. From Madeline, just 7 words: "Can we meet? Just us, please." Curiosity outweighed dread. Ivy walked back to St. Helena's, the place where everything had cracked open. She found her sister sitting alone on a bench near the East Wing exit. No makeup, no audience, just hospital socks and a hoodie pulled tight around her frail frame. Madeline didn't look up right away. When she did, her voice was quiet, stripped of its old arrogance. "They only kept you in case I needed something one day." The admission was cold, but it carried no triumph, only exhaustion. Ivy's chest tightened, but her reply was steady. "Good, because I'm not offering forgiveness." No raised voices, no tears. Just 2 sisters, no 2 strangers, acknowledging what blood had never made them. And in that silence, Ivy realized the power of her choice. She could have screamed, she could have begged. But she didn't. The absence of forgiveness was its own declaration. She rose and left Madeline on that bench, walking into the crisp autumn evening. This time, her steps felt lighter. Weeks later, Ivy stood before a clerk at the county office. On the counter lay her petition for a legal name change. Not a disguise, not an escape. A choice. The name she signed wasn't an inheritance or a burden, it was hers. That evening, she returned home to find a letter in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, the handwriting slanted but strong. "Hi Ivy. I saw your story. I'm adopted too. I didn't know I could say no either. Thank you for showing me I can. I'm 17. You gave me something I didn't know I was allowed to have. Choice." No signature, no name, just proof that her pain had carved a path for someone else's survival. Ivy pressed the paper to her chest, tears stinging her eyes, not from sorrow, but from purpose. Her story hadn't ended in humiliation. It had transformed into a weapon, a lantern for others stumbling in silence. And so she chose to speak one final time, not in a courtroom, not in a press conference, but directly to those who had watched her journey unfold. She recorded a video, her voice steady, her gaze clear. "Abusive sister forged papers. DNA took back my voice. If you've ever been erased by the people meant to protect you, hear me. Your worth is not up for negotiation. Your voice is not too loud, and you are not alone. Tell me in the comments what truth you would speak if fear wasn't holding your tongue. Because maybe, just maybe, your story is the one someone else needs to breathe again. And if you believe stories like this matter, subscribe, stay. Be part of a space where silence isn't survival anymore. It's a choice you never have to make again. She clicked post. Outside, the night hummed with life. Inside, Ivy Ballard finally felt free.